My dying grandmother confessed she'd been secretly feeding 14 grandchildren deep in the West Virginia mountains for 43 years. Her actual grandchildren, my nieces and nephews, half-human, half-Bigfoot hybrids born from my own family. She kept them alive. Now she's gone, and I'm the only one who knows they exist. Before we continue, comment below where in the world you are watching from, and please click like and subscribe. She didn't tell me all at once. The morphine wouldn't let her stay focused that long. She'd talk for maybe 15 minutes, sometimes 20, and then the pain would surge through whatever the hospice nurses had pumped into her IV, and her eyes would close, and I'd sit there in the plastic chair beside her hospital bed, holding what she'd just given me like a live wire I couldn't set down. Her name was Margaret Louise Keller, but everyone in Braxton County called her Maggie. She died on a Thursday morning in March of 2019 at Camden Clark Medical Center in Parkersburg, West Virginia. She was 84 years old and weighed maybe 90 pounds, down from the solid 160 she'd carried most of her life. Ovarian cancer had hollowed her out over 14 months, turning a woman who could still chop firewood at 80 into something that looked like a bundle of sticks wrapped in parchment. The first real conversation happened 8 days before she died. She was still lucid then, still fighting, still herself in the ways that mattered. I was sitting with her on a Tuesday afternoon, watching the gray March light come through the window when she turned her head on the pillow and looked at me with an expression I'd only seen on her face one other time in my life. It was the look she'd had when my grandfather died in 1987, when she'd stood at his graveside and watched them lower the casket and hadn't cried, hadn't spoken, just looked at the pine trees on the ridge above the cemetery, with eyes that were saying goodbye to more than one thing. "Jenny," she said, and her voice was barely there, just breath shaped into my name. "I need to tell you something I should have told you 30 years ago." I told her it was okay, that whatever it was could wait until she felt stronger, but she reached for my hand with fingers that were all bone and tendon, and she gripped harder than I thought she had strength for. "No," she said, "it cannot wait. I've been carrying this since before you were born, and if I die without telling someone, they'll have nobody. You understand? They'll have nobody." I didn't understand, not then, but I said okay, and I pulled my chair closer, and my grandmother began to unload a secret that had been sitting inside her chest like a stone in a river for more than 4 decades. My name is Jennifer Ann Keller Morrison. People call me Jenny. I'm 53 years old, and I teach 3rd grade at Burnsville Elementary School in Braxton County, West Virginia. I've been teaching for 27 years. I have a master's degree in education from West Virginia University, a mortgage on a 3-bedroom house in Flatwoods, and 2 grown daughters who live in Charleston. I coach youth soccer on weekends. I vote in every election. I go to church most Sundays at Burnsville United Methodist. I'm telling you these things so you understand that I'm not the kind of person who believes in fairy tales or cryptids or any of the nonsense that gets sold in tourist traps along Route 19. I'm a school teacher. I believe in lesson plans and standardized tests and parent-teacher conferences. I believe in things you can see and measure and explain. But I also believe my grandmother and what she told me in that hospital room over 8 days in March of 2019 has rearranged every assumption I ever made about what's possible in these mountains. Before I tell you what she said, you need to understand who Maggie Keller was. She was born in 1935 in a hollow outside Sutton, West Virginia, in a 2-room cabin that didn't have electricity until she was 12 years old. Her father, my great-grandfather, worked in the coal mines near Weston. Her mother raised 7 children and kept a garden that fed the family through winters when there wasn't money for anything except kerosene and flour. Maggie was the second youngest, and she grew up in poverty that makes today's struggles look like inconvenience. Not the kind of poor where you worry about your phone bill, the kind where you wore shoes made from tire rubber and ate squirrel meat 4 times a week because that's what there was. She met my grandfather, Robert Keller, in 1954 at a church social in Burnsville. He was 22, fresh back from Korea, working at a sawmill and saving money to buy land. She was 19, working as a clerk at the general store and saving money for the same reason. They married 6 months later in a ceremony that cost $11 and drew half the town. In 1956, they used their combined savings plus a loan from Robert's brother to buy 87 acres of mountain land in eastern Braxton County, about 9 miles outside Burnsville. The property backed up against thousands of acres of national forest, unbroken ridges of oak and hickory and hemlock that stretched all the way to the border with Nicholas County. They built a house on that land with their own hands, cutting the timber from their own property, and they lived there for the next 63 years. My mother, Caroline, was born in 1958. My Uncle Thomas came along in 1961. I arrived in 1966, and my brother David in 1969. We all grew up on that property, and I thought I knew every acre of it. The barn where Grandpa kept his tools, the chicken coop that always smelled like dust and feed, the garden where Grandma grew beans and tomatoes and squash in rows so straight they looked surveyed, the tree line where the mowed grass ended and the forest began, a wall of green that ran along the eastern edge of the property like the border of another country. I played in those woods as a kid, built forts, picked blackberries, helped my grandfather set rabbit snares. I thought I knew what was in there. I was wrong. Here's something about growing up in Appalachia in the 1970s. The mountains are not quiet. I don't mean the normal sounds, the owls and the coyotes and the wind moving through the canopy. I mean the other sounds, the ones that came from deep in the forest, especially in the fall when the leaves started turning and the air got that bite to it that meant winter was coming. Sounds that I would lie in bed and listen to through my window, sounds that my grandmother never acknowledged even when they were loud enough to rattle the glass. Wood knocking, deep, rhythmic knocking, like someone was hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat. Except no person would be out in those woods at 3 in the morning, and the knocking would go on for 10, 15 minutes sometimes, echoing across the hollow behind the house. Calls that started low and climbed into a register that didn't belong to any animal I'd learned about in school. Long, rising howls that made our dog, a German shepherd named Duke, crawl under the porch and refuse to come out even when we called him with food. And sometimes, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, a scream. Not a bobcat, not a mountain lion, though that's what my mother always said it was. A scream that sounded almost human but wasn't. That came from somewhere in the national forest behind our property and hung in the air like it was waiting for someone to answer. I asked my grandmother about the sounds exactly once. I was maybe 8 years old, summer of 1974, and something had screamed in the woods so loud that Duke had dug a hole under the porch and buried himself in it. My grandmother was sitting on the back porch shelling peas, and I said, "Grandma, what is that? What's making that noise?" She didn't look up from the peas. Her hands kept moving, thumbs splitting the pods, peas tumbling into the bowl in her lap. But I saw something cross her face. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked, when I think about it now, like recognition mixed with resignation. "Just the mountain talking, Jenny," she said. "Woods make all kinds of sounds when you're not used to them." I said we'd lived here my whole life. I was used to the woods. She looked at me then, and her eyes had something in them I didn't have words for at 8 years old. "Some things you don't get used to," she said. "You just learn to live alongside them." The conversation ended there. In the Keller household, when Grandma spoke in that tone, you didn't push. I went back inside and listened to the sounds and didn't ask again. Not for 44 years. My grandfather died in January of 1987. Heart attack. Quick and clean. The way he'd wanted to go if he had to go at all. He was 55 years old, working on a section of fence on the eastern edge of the property, and he dropped dead with a hammer in his hand and his face toward the forest. After he passed, my grandmother changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would alarm anyone, but she became more focused on the property, more insistent about maintaining certain boundaries, more resistant to any suggestion that she might want to move into town or sell some of the acreage or let any of us kids help with the heavier work. She said she could manage, and she did. For 32 more years, Maggie Keller managed that property mostly by herself, turning down every offer of help with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and a politeness that was also a wall. What I didn't know until she told me in that hospital room was where she went 3 or 4 times a week during those 32 years. She'd tell my mother she was checking fence lines or clearing trails or managing the timber on the back 40. And she did do those things. But the real reason she walked those ridges had nothing to do with fences or timber. She was bringing food to her grandchildren, the ones who lived in the forest behind the property, the ones who had never set foot in the house, the ones whose parents were her daughter and her son, and something that wasn't human. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how insane that sentence looks, written out in plain language. My grandmother had 14 grandchildren living in the West Virginia mountains who were half Bigfoot. That's what she told me. And before you dismiss this as the morphine talking or the cancer reaching her brain or a dying woman's confusion, let me tell you what else she gave me in that hospital room. Dates, names, physical descriptions, locations, details so specific and consistent across 8 days of conversations that they couldn't be hallucination. I'm a teacher. I know the difference between confused rambling and coherent testimony. What my grandmother gave me was testimony. She told me the first one was born in the spring of 1976. A girl, the child of my Uncle Thomas, who would have been 15 years old at the time. She told me Thomas never knew, that the mother took the baby and disappeared into the forest before my uncle even knew she was pregnant, that the only reason Grandma knew was because the mother came to her at the tree line one morning in May with a bundle wrapped in leaves and moss, and laid that bundle at Maggie Keller's feet and looked at her with eyes that were brown and intelligent and desperate. My grandmother said those eyes communicated something that needed no language. This is your grandchild. This is your blood. Will you help? And my grandmother, who had been raised to believe that family was everything, who had grown up in a world where you took care of your own, no matter what, looked at that baby, looked at that mother, and said yes. She told me this on the 3rd day, after she'd already told me about the sounds and the sightings she'd had over the years, and the way the forest behind the property had always felt like it was watching. She told me in a voice that was steady despite the pain, and when she finished, she looked at me and said, "You think I'm crazy." I didn't answer right away. I was 53 years old, sitting in a hospital room in Parkersburg, listening to my grandmother tell me that she'd been secretly raising hybrid children in the Appalachian Mountains for 4 decades. Crazy was one word for it, but I looked at her eyes, and they were clear. Yellow from the jaundice, exhausted from the pain, but clear, present, lucid, certain. "Tell me the rest," I said. Her name was Sena. That's the closest my grandmother could get to the sound the mother made when she brought the baby to the tree line. A soft, musical sound that rose and fell like water over rocks. Sena. She was tiny, maybe 4 pounds at birth, covered in fine, dark hair that was softer than anything my grandmother had ever felt. But her face was different than her mother's face, more human, flatter, with a nose that was broader than mine or yours, but not as broad as the mother's. And when she opened her eyes and looked at my grandmother, the eyes were hazel, green-brown, Keller eyes, Thomas's eyes. The mother nursed her for the first 6 months, and my grandmother brought them food during that time, not to the tree line, deeper in. The mother led her to a place about 2 miles into the national forest, a sheltered hollow with a spring and a rock overhang that provided cover from weather. My grandmother walked there 3 times a week with a pack full of vegetables and bread and canned goods, and the mother would take the food and nod, and sometimes she'd let my grandmother hold Sena while she ate. My grandmother said holding that baby was like holding any newborn, fragile and warm and needy. She made the same sounds babies make. She cried when she was hungry and cooed when she was content, and gripped my grandmother's finger with a strength that was maybe a little stronger than normal, but not impossible. When Sena was 6 months old, the mother stopped nursing and started teaching her to eat solid foods. My grandmother watched the process with fascination. The mother would chew tough plants and meat and then feed the pulp to Sena mouth to mouth, the same way birds feed their young. And Sena would swallow and reach for more, learning fast, adapting. By the time she was a year old, Sena could walk. Not the wobbling, uncertain steps of a human toddler. Confident, balanced walking with feet that gripped the ground in a way that suggested she'd been designed for uneven terrain. By 2 years old, she could climb trees. By 3, she could move through the forest so quietly that my grandmother couldn't hear her coming, even when she was watching for her. My grandmother visited them until Sena was 5, and then the mother took her and moved deeper into the forest, into territory my grandmother couldn't access safely. The last time she saw Sena, the girl was tall for her age, maybe the height of a 7-year-old human child, with long dark hair and those hazel eyes and a smile that was sweet and shy. I never saw her again after that, my grandmother told me, but I know she's still out there, somewhere in those mountains. She'd be 43 now, and she probably has children of her own. The second one was born in 1978. This time it was my mother's child, my mother Caroline Keller, who married my father in 1977 and had me in 1966 and my brother in 1969, and who never, to my knowledge, had any other children, except she did. My grandmother told me this on the 4th day. She'd been drifting in and out of sleep, and I'd been sitting there reading a book, half convinced that the whole thing was fever dreams and medication side effects. But then she opened her eyes and looked at me and said, "The second one was your mother's." I put the book down. "Mom doesn't have another child." "She does," my grandmother said. "She just doesn't know he survived." The story came out in pieces, but here's what I understand. In 1977, when my mother was 19 and newly married, she went missing for 3 days. I'd heard the story before, family legend, the time Mom wandered off into the woods and got lost and stumbled back half dead from exposure. She'd gone for a hike on the property, lost track of time, lost the trail, panicked, spent 2 nights in the forest before finding her way back to the house. That was the version I'd always heard. That was the version my mother told. Maybe that was the version she remembered. But my grandmother told me a different version. She said my mother hadn't gotten lost. She'd been taken, not violently, not kidnapped in the way we think of it, but led away, drawn deeper into the forest by something she followed without fully understanding why she was following it. My grandmother said my mother came back changed, quiet, distant, wouldn't talk about what happened. And 9 months later, my mother went into labor a month earlier than expected, alone in the house while my father was at work, and she delivered a baby that didn't look quite right. My grandmother was there. She saw the baby, dark hair covering most of its body, fingers that were longer than they should be, eyes that were brown like my mother's but shaped differently, set wider. My mother looked at that baby and screamed, and then she passed out from blood loss and shock. My grandmother made a decision in that moment that she'd been living with for 41 years. She cleaned up my mother, made sure she was stable, and then she took that baby into the woods. She found the mother, the same one who'd brought Sena 2 years earlier, and she gave her the child. When my mother woke up, my grandmother told her the baby had been stillborn, that it happened sometimes, that it wasn't her fault. And my mother, who was 19 and traumatized and maybe blocking out memories she couldn't process, believed her. She never asked to see the body, my grandmother said. And I never offered. I told her we'd buried it on the property under the oak tree by the spring, and she believed me because she wanted to believe me, because the alternative was too terrible. The baby's name was Kale. The mother named him, and my grandmother checked on him regularly for the first 5 years. He grew faster than Sena had, bigger. By the time he was 4, he was the size of an 8-year-old, with shoulders starting to broaden and a voice that was already deeper than a child's voice should be. He looked like your father, my grandmother said, in the eyes, in the shape of his jaw under all that hair. He was your mother's son, Jenny, your brother, and he's still out there. After Kale, the births came more frequently. Not every year, but close. My grandmother said she stopped counting after the 8th one because the numbers didn't matter as much as the pattern. The pattern was this: young women and men from the Keller family would go into the woods, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. They'd come back different, quieter, changed in ways that were hard to name. And 9 months later, there would be a baby that didn't look quite right. Not all of them. My grandmother was clear about that. Of her 4 children and 9 legitimate grandchildren, only 2 had produced these hybrid children, Thomas and Caroline, my uncle and my mother. Something about them, something in their blood or their pheromones or their psychology attracted the others. The others. That's what my grandmother called them. Not Bigfoot, not Sasquatch, just the others. As if giving them a clinical name would somehow diminish what they were, which was older than any name we could give them. She said they'd been in those mountains longer than any human settlement, that the Cherokee had known about them and left them alone, that the first European settlers had seen them and called them devils or wild men and tried to hunt them, until they learned that hunting something with that level of intelligence was a good way to lose hunters. The others had learned to avoid humans, to stay hidden, to move through the forest like ghosts. But sometimes, maybe once in a generation, there would be contact, usually brief, usually ending with the human running away, with a story no one would believe. But sometimes, rarely, there would be attraction. My grandmother said she didn't understand the mechanism, whether it was pheromones or choice or something else entirely. But sometimes a human and one of the others would come together. And 9 months later, there would be a child that belonged to both worlds and fully to neither. 14 times over 43 years, this had happened with my family. 14 children born from unions that shouldn't have been possible. 14 grandchildren that my grandmother had helped raise in secret, bringing them food and supplies and teaching them words and keeping them safe from a world that would have locked them in cages or killed them outright. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked her on the 5th day. "Why not 10 years ago? 20? She looked at me with those yellow, exhausted eyes. "Because I'm dying, Jenny. And someone needs to know. Someone needs to keep bringing them food when I can't anymore. Someone needs to check on them and make sure they're safe and remember that they're family, even if they don't look like it." "You want me to do it," I said. "I need you to do it," she said. "They're your nieces and nephews, Jenny, your half-siblings, your kin. And when I'm gone, they'll have nobody who knows they exist." On the 6th day, My grandmother told me about the notebook. She said it was in her house, in the bedroom, in the bottom drawer of the dresser that had been my grandfather's. Under a stack of old quilts and a King James Bible with a cracked spine, there was a composition book with a black and white marbled cover. 43 years of records, names, birth dates, descriptions, locations, every visit documented, every child cataloged, sketches drawn with a shaky hand, but enough detail to show what she'd seen. She told me where to find the key to the house. She told me to go there before the funeral, before my mother and uncle started going through her things. She told me to take the notebook and keep it safe and never show it to anyone who wouldn't understand. I drove down to Burnsville the next day. It was a Wednesday, cold and gray. March, trying to decide whether it was still winter or ready to let go. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Houses do that when the people who filled them are gone or dying. They shrink. They become just structures instead of homes. I let myself in with the key my grandmother had described, hidden under a flower pot on the back porch that hadn't held a flower in 5 years. The house smelled like her, like lavender and wood smoke and the faint medicinal smell of the ointments she'd used for her arthritis. I went to the bedroom, found the dresser, pulled open the bottom drawer. The notebook was exactly where she said it would be. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The first entry was dated May 17th, 1976. The handwriting was my grandmother's, younger and steadier than it had been in her later years, but unmistakably hers. Sena, born today. Approximately 4 pounds, dark hair, hazel eyes, mother healthy, brought vegetables and bread. She accepted. Baby nursing well. I turned the pages, entry after entry, year after year. Births and growth rates and behavioral observations and sketches that showed faces that were both human and not. Children growing from infants to toddlers to teenagers to adults, all documented in my grandmother's careful, methodical handwriting. There were 14 names in that notebook. Sena, born 1976, mother's side. Kale, born 1978, mother's side. Dena, born 1981, Thomas's side. Mako, born 1983, mother's side. Ren, born 1985, Thomas's side. Tala, born 1987, mother's side. Voss, born 1990, Thomas's side. Lyra, born 1992, Thomas's side. Joss, born 1994, mother's side. Kenna, born 1997, Thomas's side. Raf, born 1999, mother's side. Dara, born 2002, Thomas's side. Mira, born 2005, Thomas's side. Finn, born 2008, mother's side. 14 grandchildren, the oldest 43, the youngest 11, all living somewhere in the mountains behind my grandmother's property. All still there, according to her last entries, dated March 2019, just 2 weeks before she went into the hospital for the last time. I sat on that bed for 2 hours reading every word, and by the time I closed the notebook and put it in my bag, I'd made a decision. I was going to find them, not to expose them, not to bring them into the world or study them or prove anything to anyone, just to see them, to know they were real, to understand what my grandmother had been protecting for 43 years, and maybe, if they'd let me, to keep bringing them food. I went to the hospital that night and told my grandmother I'd found the notebook. She nodded, slow and exhausted, and said, "Good girl." Then she gave me directions, specific, detailed directions that cut through the morphine haze, like she was reading from a map she'd memorized decades ago. Go past the spring on the Eastern Trail. Follow the deer path until you reach the split oak. Take the left fork and climb to the ridge. When you see the rock face with the overhang, you're close. They use that area. Leave food there. Apples if you have them. They remember apples. Will they come? I asked. They'll come, she said. They know family. They can smell it on you. And if you tell them Maggie sent you, they'll understand. My grandmother died 3 days later, Thursday morning, March 28th, 2019, at 6:47 a.m. I was holding her hand when her breathing changed, when the spaces between breaths got longer and longer until one of them just didn't end. The nurse came in and checked for a pulse and said she was sorry, and I sat there for another 10 minutes because my legs wouldn't work. Not because of grief, though the grief was massive and real and sharp, because of the weight of what she'd given me. A secret that was also a responsibility. 14 grandchildren I'd never met. A promise I hadn't explicitly made, but that sat on my shoulders like a physical load. The funeral was on Saturday. Half of Braxton County showed up. Maggie Keller had been a fixture in that community for 63 years, and people came to pay respects with casseroles and handshakes and stories about what a fine woman she'd been. I stood at the graveside in a black dress that I'd bought that morning and shook hands and said thank you, and listened to stories I'd heard before. The whole time I was thinking about a hollow in the woods and 14 grandchildren. My mother and uncle went through the house on Monday, dividing up furniture and keepsakes and deciding what to keep and what to donate. I told them I'd already taken what I wanted, a few photographs and some of Grandma's quilts. I didn't mention the notebook. I went back to the property on Tuesday. My uncle had agreed to keep it in the family, at least for now, managing it as a rental or maybe selling it later. But for the moment, it was empty. No one there but memories and the wind moving through the trees. I parked in the driveway and sat in my car for 10 minutes staring at the tree line. It was early April, the mountains just starting to wake up from winter. Buds on the trees, birds calling, that smell in the air that's part thaw and part new growth. I got out of the car, opened the trunk, pulled out the bag I'd packed, apples, bread, peanut butter, dried fruit, canned peaches, bottled water, everything my grandmother's notebook had said they liked. My hands were shaking. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I was a 53-year-old school teacher about to walk into the woods looking for 14 half-human relatives I'd never met, following directions given to me by a dying woman. The rational part of my brain, the part that graded spelling tests and attended faculty meetings and paid my mortgage on time, was screaming at me to get back in the car and drive home and pretend none of this had ever happened. But my grandmother's voice was louder. "They'll have nobody, Jenny, nobody." I thought about the notebook, about 43 years of entries written in Maggie Keller's careful hand, about sketches of children with my uncle's eyes and my mother's chin and hair that covered bodies in ways that shouldn't be possible, about a woman who'd walked these ridges 3 times a week for 4 decades, carrying food and keeping secrets and protecting family in the only way she knew how. If she could do it for 43 years, I could do it for one afternoon. I walked across the backyard, past the garden plot that was already starting to grow over with weeds, past the chicken coop that hadn't held chickens in years, to the tree line where the mowed grass ended and the forest began. I stood there for a minute, looking into the green shadows, feeling the same thing I'd felt as a kid when I'd stared into these woods and wondered what was looking back. The difference was, now I knew what was looking back, and they were family. Then I stepped across the line and started walking. The forest swallowed me whole within 20 steps. That's how it felt. One moment I was standing in sunlight at the edge of my grandmother's property, and the next I was enclosed in green shadow, surrounded by oak and hickory, and the smell of last year's leaves decomposing into the earth. I followed my grandmother's directions from memory, past the spring on the eastern trail. The spring was still there, trickling out of a crack in a limestone outcrop, the same spring I'd drunk from as a kid on hot summer days. The water was clear and cold, and I stopped for a moment to listen to it, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. The deer path was exactly where she'd said it would be. Not a hiking trail, nothing maintained or marked, just a narrow track through the underbrush where generations of whitetail had worn the vegetation down to dirt. I followed it uphill, climbing gradually, my breath getting shorter as the elevation increased. The split oak appeared after maybe 15 minutes of walking, a massive tree that had been struck by lightning at some point in the past. The trunk split down the middle, but both halves still alive, still growing, creating a V shape that framed the path ahead. I took the left fork like my grandmother had instructed. The ridge came into view after another 10 minutes of climbing, and there, exactly as she'd described, was a rock face with a natural overhang, creating a sheltered area maybe 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep. I stopped about 50 yards away and set the bag of food on a flat rock. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked around at the forest, at the walls of green pressing in from all sides, and I felt that same sensation I'd felt as a kid, that awareness of being watched. I called out. My voice sounded small in all that space, swallowed by the trees. "My name is Jenny. I'm Maggie's granddaughter, Maggie Keller. She asked me to come." Nothing moved. The forest was so quiet I could hear individual leaves rustling in the breeze. I tried again. "She passed away last week, but she told me about you. She told me about all of you, and she asked me to keep bringing food." Still nothing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 5 minutes. Then I did what my grandmother had done for 43 years. I left the food and I walked away. I came back 3 days later. The food was gone. Every apple, every piece of bread, the jar of peanut butter I'd left, all of it taken. But nothing else had been disturbed. No signs of animals, no bear tracks, no evidence of raccoons or possums getting into the supplies. Just the absence of food and a sense that I'd been accepted, or at least not rejected. I brought more food. Apples again, plus canned peaches, dried fruit, jerky, a loaf of homemade bread I'd baked the night before. I set it on the same rock and called out the same greeting. And then I sat down on a fallen log about 30 yards away and waited. I waited for 2 hours. Nothing happened. The light changed as the sun moved across the sky, shadows shifting and lengthening, but nothing emerged from the forest. Finally, I stood up and walked back to the house, my knees stiff from sitting, my hopes starting to feel like foolishness. But I came back. I came back the next weekend and the weekend after that. Every Saturday and Sunday, I drove down from Flatwoods to my grandmother's property, walked the ridge to the overhang, left food, and waited. On my 7th visit, something changed. I'd left the supplies and taken my usual position on the fallen log, and I was watching a pileated woodpecker work on a dead snag about 40 yards away when I felt it. That prickling on the back of my neck that tells you you're not alone. I turned my head slowly. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and undergrowth and the dappled light filtering through the canopy. But then a shape resolved itself from what I'd been looking at as a shadow near the rock face. Someone was standing there, someone large. My breath caught. Every muscle in my body locked up. The shape didn't move. Neither did I. We stared at each other across 30 yards of forest floor, and I felt the same thing my grandmother must have felt when she first saw one of the others. Recognition that bypassed rational thought. This was real. This had always been real. The figure stepped forward into better light, and I could see her more clearly. She was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, with dark reddish-brown hair covering her body from head to foot. But her face, while different from any human face I'd seen, had an intelligence in the eyes that was unmistakable. She was looking at me the way you look at someone you're trying to understand, trying to place. I said the only thing I could think of. "Maggie sent me." Something shifted in her expression. Her head tilted slightly. She made a sound, low and musical, that rose and fell like a question. "Maggie Keller," I said. My grandmother. She died. But she told me to come here. She told me to bring food. She told me about you." The figure took another step closer, then another. She moved with a fluidity that was almost unsettling, each step covering more ground than seemed possible. Within seconds, she was standing maybe 10 feet from where I sat, close enough that I could smell her, musky and warm, like the smell of the forest after rain, mixed with something else, something almost human. She looked down at me with those intelligent brown eyes, and I saw my grandmother in those eyes. Not physically, but in the recognition. This creature knew who Maggie Keller was, had known her for decades, and was trying to figure out who I was. I stood up slowly, carefully, keeping my hands visible. "I'm Jenny," I said, "Maggie's granddaughter, Caroline's daughter." At Caroline's name, something definitely changed. The figure's eyes widened slightly. She made another sound, this one more urgent, and she gestured with one massive hand toward the forest behind her. She wanted me to follow. Every rational instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get back to the car and drive away and never come back. But my grandmother's voice was louder. "They're family, Jenny. They're your kin." I followed. She led me deeper into the forest, moving at a pace that forced me to almost jog to keep up. We went down a steep slope into a hollow I'd never seen before, a place where the terrain dropped away so sharply that the sunlight barely reached the bottom. A creek ran through it, clear water moving over smooth stones, and along the banks I could see evidence of habitation, not houses. Not structures in any way I'd recognize, but signs, stacks of flat rocks that created natural shelters, piles of branches arranged deliberately, areas where the vegetation had been cleared away to create open spaces, and there were others, 3 of them, no, 4, sitting near the creek or standing in the shadows under the trees, all of them watching me with the same intense, evaluating stare. The one who'd brought me here made a series of sounds, complex vocalizations that carried meaning even though I couldn't understand the words. She was introducing me, explaining who I was. One of the others stood up. This one was male, I thought, broader in the shoulders, with darker hair and a face that was somehow more human than the females. He was huge, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, but his eyes were what stopped me. They were hazel, green-brown, Keller eyes. "Sena," I said, looking at the female who'd brought me here. She made an affirming sound, a low huff that I interpreted as yes. I looked at the male. "Kale?" He stepped closer, and when he was about 6 feet away, he did something that made my throat close up. He smiled, a wide, unmistakably human smile that showed teeth that were larger than mine but shaped the same way, and he said a word, "Jenny." He knew my name. My grandmother had told him about me. For 43 years, Maggie Keller had walked these ridges and talked to her hybrid grandchildren about her human family, about me. I sat down on the nearest rock because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore, and Kale, my half-brother who I'd never known existed until 2 weeks ago, sat down across from me with the same careful movement I'd seen in Sena, folding his massive frame down with surprising grace. He looked at me with those hazel eyes I saw in the mirror every morning, and he said another word. "Mother?" He was asking about my mother, his mother, the woman who'd given birth to him and never knew he survived. "She's alive," I said. "She lives in Charleston. She doesn't know about you. She thinks you died." I don't know how much of that he understood. His vocabulary was limited, I'd learn later, to maybe 50 words that my grandmother had taught him over decades of visits, but he understood enough. His face did something complicated, not quite sadness, not quite longing, but something in that family of emotions. "Grandmother," he said. "Gone?" "Yes," I said, and my voice cracked. "She's gone." The sound he made then was the same sound I'd heard in my grandmother's stories, a keening, low and sustained, that came from deep in his chest. Grief, pure and unmistakable grief for a woman who'd been the only consistent human contact in his entire life. Sena made the same sound. And then the others joined in, and that hollow filled with mourning, 4 hybrid creatures expressing loss in the most universal language there is. I cried with them, sat on that rock in a hidden hollow in the West Virginia mountains and cried, with my half-brother and my aunt and my other relatives, whose names I didn't even know yet, all of us grieving for Maggie Keller, who'd kept us connected across an impossible divide. I visited every weekend after that, sometimes twice a week when I could get away from work. And slowly, over months, I began to understand the world my grandmother had been protecting for 43 years. There were 9 of them in that hollow, not 14. 5 had moved deeper into the mountains, into territory even Sena and Kale couldn't reliably access. My grandmother's last entries in the notebook had noted this. The oldest ones, the ones who were more other than human, had migrated away, following patterns that were older than language. But 9 remained, and they remembered Maggie. Their names, the ones I could pronounce, were Sena, Kale, Dena, Mako, Ren, Lyra, Joss, Kenna, and Dara. Ages ranging from 43 down to 17. Some of them were siblings, children of the same human parent. Others were cousins, though those categories mattered less to them than they did to me. They lived in a way that was neither fully human nor fully other. They built shelters but not houses. They used tools but not technology. They communicated with sounds and gestures and a physical language that was incredibly complex and that I was only beginning to understand. Kyle showed me how they caught fish, not with poles or nets, but with their hands, moving through the creek with patience and speed that seemed impossible. Sena showed me which plants they ate, which ones they used for medicine, which ones they avoided. Dena, who was quieter and more cautious than the others, eventually let me watch her weave grasses into something like a basket, her enormous fingers working with a delicacy that was beautiful. They were vegetarian mostly, though they ate fish and occasionally small game. They knew where every fruit tree grew within a 10-mile radius. They harvested wild honey without getting stung because they moved slowly enough and calmly enough that the bees didn't see them as a threat. I learned that they didn't understand ownership the way humans do. Food was shared communally. Shelters were used by whoever needed them at the moment. The concept of mine versus yours didn't translate. Everything belonged to everyone, or more accurately, everything just existed and was available as needed. I learned that they communicated across distances with wood knocking, the same sounds I'd heard as a child. Different patterns meant different things. 3 slow knocks. All is well. Rapid knocking, danger, a specific rhythm that sounded almost like a song. Food available, come eat. I learned that they mourned their dead the same way humans do, and that they'd buried the others who died over the years in a grove deeper in the hollow, marked with stacked stones and arrangements of objects that had meaning. Sena's mother was buried there. Kale's mother, the same creature, 2 others who died in the harsh winter of 2014, and I learned that they were gentle. My grandmother had been right about that. For all their size and strength, for all their difference, they were the gentlest souls I'd ever encountered. Kale could pick up a bird with a broken wing and hold it in his enormous hands without harming it. Lyra once spent an entire afternoon helping a fawn that had gotten separated from its mother, staying with it until the doe returned. They were not monsters. They were not cryptids or legends or things to be feared. They were my family, and they needed me the same way I was starting to realize I needed them. I kept my promise to my grandmother for 2 years before anyone asked me the question I'd been dreading. It was Kale who asked. We were sitting by the creek on a late summer afternoon in 2021, watching Joss teach Dara how to catch crawfish. Kyle had been quiet most of the visit, which wasn't unusual. He processed things slowly, thoughtfully, taking time to work through ideas before expressing them. He turned to me and said, in his halting, carefully constructed way, "Why grandmother tell you? Why not before?" It was the most complex question he'd ever asked me, and I didn't have a good answer. Because she was dying, I said. She knew she couldn't keep taking care of you. She needed someone else to know you existed. Kale shook his head, frustrated. He tried again. Why hide us? Why not tell all family? And there it was, the question that had been sitting in my chest, like a weight since my grandmother first told me the truth. Why had she hidden them? Why had she lied to my mother about Kale's death? Why had she spent 43 years keeping this massive secret instead of bringing it into the light? I knew the answer, my grandmother had told me, because the world would have destroyed them, would have locked them in laboratories or killed them or turned them into spectacles, because there was no place in modern society for creatures that challenged every assumption about what's possible. But how do you explain that to someone who's never known anything except these mountains? How do you tell your half-brother that the reason he's never met his mother is because his existence would have broken her mind and ruined her life? The world is dangerous, I said finally. People are afraid of things they don't understand, and if they knew about you, they would hurt you. Grandmother was protecting you. Kale was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that I think about almost every day. Protecting or hiding. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. Kale's question had opened something I'd been trying to keep closed, the uncomfortable truth that my grandmother's protection had also been a kind of imprisonment. These 9 people, my relatives, had spent their entire lives hidden in a hollow in the mountains because the alternative was too dangerous to consider. But was it? Was it really impossible to imagine a world where they could exist openly? Where my mother could know her son? Where these incredible, gentle, intelligent beings could be acknowledged as what they were? A bridge between 2 worlds, proof that the boundaries we draw between human and not human are nowhere near as solid as we pretend. I spent 3 months wrestling with that question, and the more time I spent in the hollow, the more convinced I became that keeping them secret wasn't protection anymore. It was just perpetuating the lie. But I also knew what would happen if I tried to bring them into the world. The media circus, the scientific scrutiny, the government agencies that would descend on Braxton County like locusts, the tourists and the hunters and the people who would see them as either proof of their beliefs or threats to their worldview. I couldn't do that to them. I wouldn't. So I made a different decision. I decided to tell the story, not with proof, not with photographs or DNA samples or any of the evidence that would make it credible to skeptics. Just the story itself. The truth as I knew it, told in a way that would let people decide for themselves what to believe. I told my husband first. We'd been married for 26 years, and I'd been keeping this secret from him for 2.5 years at that point. The weight of it was destroying me, and I knew I couldn't carry it alone anymore. I sat him down at our kitchen table on a Sunday night in November of 2021, and I told him everything. About the deathbed confession, about the notebook, about the 9 hybrid relatives living in the mountains, about the 2 years I'd been visiting them every weekend while he thought I was going down to manage my grandmother's property. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked me one question. Are they safe? The same question Laura had asked in the other story. The same question that matters more than belief or proof or any of the skepticism. Yes, I said, they're safe. They've been safe for 43 years. He nodded. Then we keep them safe, whatever that takes. I told my daughters next. They were 31 and 28, both married, both with kids of their own. I told them the same way I'd told my husband, laying out the whole story from beginning to end, and waiting for them to decide whether their mother had lost her mind. My oldest daughter cried. My youngest one wanted to meet them immediately. We went as a family the next weekend. My husband, my daughters, my 2 sons-in-law, my 4 grandchildren. 13 people walking into a hollow in the West Virginia mountains to meet relatives we'd never known existed. Kyle emerged first, then Sena, then the others, slowly, cautiously, watching this influx of humans with careful attention. My youngest grandson, who was 4 at the time, saw Kyle and said, "Big man." Kyle looked at this tiny human child and did something I'd never seen him do before. He knelt down, lowering himself to the child's eye level, and he held out one enormous hand, palm up, in a gesture of peace. My grandson, who was afraid of nothing, walked right up and put his little hand in Kale's palm. And Kale, my half-brother who'd never known the touch of another human besides my grandmother and me until that moment, smiled that wide, unmistakable smile and said, "Small." Everyone laughed. Humans and hybrids both. And in that moment, I knew I'd made the right decision. It's March of 2024 now. 5 years since my grandmother died. 5 years since I learned the truth. I still visit every weekend. So does my family. The Hollow has become a second home, a place where my grandchildren play with their hybrid relatives, where my husband sits by the creek and talks with Kale about things that don't need many words, where my daughters bring food and supplies and love. We've taught them more words. Kale's vocabulary is over 300 now. Sena can hold complex conversations using a combination of English words, sign language, and that physical communication that I'm still learning, Dena writes. Not fluently, not in the way a human child would write, but she can form letters and simple words with a stick in the dirt, and she understands that those symbols carry meaning. They've taught us things too: patience, presence, the ability to sit in silence and just be, the knowledge that intelligence and consciousness come in forms we're not trained to recognize, the understanding that family is defined by connection, not biology or appearance. 3 of the 5 who'd migrated away have come back, drawn by the increased activity, by the presence of more humans, by something I don't fully understand but that feels like hope, like the possibility of a different future. We've been careful. We haven't told anyone outside our immediate family. We haven't taken photographs or collected samples or done any of the things that would turn this into proof. Because proof would destroy what we're building. It would turn them into specimens instead of people. It would bring the world crashing down on this hollow and everyone in it. But I've been thinking about Kale's question, about the difference between protecting and hiding, about whether keeping them secret is really the same as keeping them safe. And I've come to believe that the truth needs to be told, not with evidence because evidence would be their death sentence, but with story, with testimony, with the kind of truth that lets people decide for themselves what to believe without demanding that they believe anything. My mother still doesn't know about Kale. That's my greatest failure and my most persistent guilt. She's 66 years old now, living in Charleston, seeing her grandchildren regularly, with no idea that her first child is alive and living in the mountains 2 hours from her house. I've tried to tell her 3 times. The words won't come. How do you tell your mother that her son, the baby she thinks died at birth 46 years ago, is alive? That her mother lied to her? That there's a piece of her life, a piece of her heart, that she doesn't even know is missing? Maybe someday I'll find the courage. Or maybe Kale will make the decision for me. He asks about her sometimes, and there's a longing in his voice that breaks my heart. He wants to know his mother, and she deserves to know her son. But for now, I do what my grandmother did. I walk the ridge 3 times a week with food and supplies and love. I bring my family to the hollow and we share meals and teach each other words and build something that feels like hope. And I tell this story, not for fame or attention or proof, but because Kale asked me to, because after 5 years of teaching him about the human world through books and pictures and patient conversation, he's become aware that people are looking for his kind, that most humans don't believe creatures like him exist. And when I explained that to him, his response was the same as it had been before. Sad, he said. Why? Why indeed? Why do we need proof before we allow ourselves to believe in possibility? Why do we demand evidence before we acknowledge that the world is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than our small human minds can compass? I don't know the answer to that, but I know this. My grandmother spent 43 years keeping a secret, and that secret kept her grandchildren alive, but it also kept them alone, cut off from half of their heritage, denied the possibility of connection with the human world because that connection was too dangerous to risk. Maybe it still is. Maybe telling this story is the stupidest, most reckless thing I could do. Maybe I'm putting them in danger just by speaking these words into the world. But maybe, just maybe, there's another possibility. Maybe there are other families out there like mine. Other people who've encountered the others and stayed quiet because they didn't want to be dismissed as crazy. Other stories that need to be told. Other connections that need to be acknowledged. Maybe if enough of us speak up, if enough of us tell our truths without demanding that anyone believe them, we can create space for a different kind of world, one where creatures like Kale and Sena can exist without being studied or hunted or turned into spectacles, where the boundaries between human and not human can be acknowledged as permeable instead of absolute. I don't know if that world is possible, but I know my grandmother believed it was worth trying. She spent 43 years building a bridge between 2 worlds with nothing but food and patience and love. And now I'm trying to extend that bridge a little further. If you've listened this far, you've probably already decided whether you believe me. That's fine. I'm not asking for belief. I'm not asking you to prove or disprove anything. I'm not going to give you coordinates or photographs or DNA samples. What I'm asking is this. If you've had an encounter, if you've seen something in the woods that shouldn't be there, if you've got a family secret that sounds impossible, don't bury it. Don't let fear or shame or the weight of societal expectations keep you from acknowledging what you know to be true. Tell your story, write it down, share it with someone you trust. Let it exist in the world as story, as testimony, as truth that doesn't require proof. Because here's what I've learned over the last 5 years. Truth and proof are not the same thing. My grandmother's truth kept 14 children alive for 4 decades. My truth has brought my family together in ways I never imagined possible, and those truths are real regardless of whether anyone believes them. The others are real. They've been in these mountains longer than any human settlement. They've watched us build towns and cities and roads through their territory, and they've adapted by becoming invisible, by learning to move through the world like ghosts. But they're not ghosts, they're people. Different from us, but not so different that connection is impossible. Not so different that family can't span the divide. My half-brother Kale is 46 years old. He's 7 feet tall and covered in dark hair, and has hazel eyes that he inherited from my mother. He knows 300 words in English and can write his name in the dirt. He catches fish with his bare hands and mourns his dead and loves his family with a purity that most humans have forgotten how to access. He's my brother, and he's real. And whether you believe that or not doesn't change the truth of it. I went to the Hollow this past weekend. It was early March. 5 years almost to the day since my grandmother died. The mountains were just starting to wake up from winter, that same smell of thaw and new growth in the air. Kyle was waiting at the ridge. He does that now, tracks my approach and meets me at the edge, as if he's worried I won't come back. We walked down to the hollow together, and the others gathered around, and we shared a meal the way we do every weekend. Apples and bread and the venison jerky that Joss has learned to make using techniques my husband taught him. After we ate, Kale pulled me aside. He had something in his hands, wrapped in leaves. He unwrapped it carefully and showed me what was inside. A photograph. Old, faded, bent at the corners. The same photograph I'd seen in his shelter years ago. My grandfather standing in front of the barn, grinning at the camera. But there was something new. Next to my grandfather's photograph, Kale had placed another one. This one was more recent, printed on copy paper, already starting to fade from exposure. It was a photo I'd given him last year, taken at my youngest daughter's wedding. It showed all of us. My husband, my daughters, my sons-in-law, my grandchildren. 3 generations of Kellers, all dressed up and smiling at the camera. Kale had arranged the 2 photographs side by side. His human family, separated by decades, united by the same connection that had kept my grandmother walking these ridges for 43 years. "Family," he said, pointing to both photographs. Then he pointed at himself, at me, at the others gathered around the creek. All family. And he was right. We are all family. Human and hybrid, visible and hidden, believed and dismissed. All of us connected by blood and choice and the stubborn refusal to let fear determine what's possible. My grandmother knew that. That's why she spent 43 years keeping a secret that was also a promise. That's why she asked me to carry that promise forward. That's why I'm telling you this story now. Not to convince you. Not to prove anything. Just to say what Kale said to me in a hollow in the West Virginia mountains on a cold March afternoon. We are here, all of us, the others, the hidden ones, the impossible creatures that live in the gaps between what we know and what we allow ourselves to believe. We are here, and we're not going anywhere. And the only question that matters is whether the rest of the world is ready to make space for us. My name is Jennifer Ann Keller Morrison. I'm 58 years old. I teach 3rd grade at Burnsville Elementary School in Braxton County, West Virginia. I have 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren, and a husband who's been patient with my weekend absences for 5 years. And I have 9 hybrid relatives living in the mountains behind my grandmother's property. I visit them every weekend. I bring them food and love and the connection to the human world that my grandmother built and that I'm trying to maintain. This is my truth. This is my story. And whether you believe it or not, it's real. We are here.